Let's start with a word. One small, seemingly harmless word that has done more damage to sensitive, deeply feeling people than almost any insult ever could. The word is just. I'm just an empath. You've said it. Maybe you've said it this week. And every time those words leave your mouth, something quiet happens. You make yourself smaller. You hand your power back before anyone even asks for it. And the tragic part? You don't even notice you're doing it. Now, where does that come from? Because human beings don't diminish themselves randomly. Dr. Gabor has spent decades showing us that the ways we shrink, the ways we disconnect from our own value, are almost never accidental. They are learned. They are adaptive. At some point in your life, probably early, probably in a home or a classroom or a relationship where being too sensitive was treated as a problem to be managed, you figured out that the safest thing to do with your emotional depth was to apologize for it, to preemptively minimize it before someone else could use it against you. The word just became a kind of armor, a disclaimer, a way of saying, don't worry, I know I'm a lot. I'll make myself easier to digest. But here's what I need you to understand. Empathy is not a personality quirk. It is not a temperament trait you were accidentally handed, like being left-handed or having a sensitive stomach. Empathy, at its core, is a neurological and psychological capacity for attunement, the ability to read emotional states, to sense what is unspoken, to track the interior lives of the people around you with a kind of precision that most people simply do not have access to. Researchers studying mirror neurons, social cognition, and interpersonal neurobiology have found that highly empathic individuals process social information differently, more deeply, more completely. You are not more emotional than other people. You are more accurate about emotion than other people. That is a distinction worth sitting with. And yet, we live in a culture that has consistently misread this capacity. We have framed empathy as softness, as vulnerability, as a liability in rooms that reward dominance and detachment. We gave it to women and then used it to exclude them from power. We pathologized it in men and called it weakness. We told children who felt everything that they were too sensitive for their own good, as if the problem was the feeling and not the environment that couldn't hold it. Generation after generation, we took one of the most sophisticated forms of human intelligence and buried it under shame. So when you say just an empath, you are not being humble. You are being historically conditioned. You are repeating a story that was written for you by people who either didn't understand what you were carrying or who understood it perfectly and found it threatening. This is where we begin, not with a technique, not with a framework, but with a fundamental act of reclassification. Empathy is not your soft spot. It is your most sophisticated intelligence. And the moment you stop treating it like an apology and start treating it like a faculty, something to be trained, directed, and deployed with intention, everything changes. You change because the world doesn't need more people who feel deeply and do nothing with it. The world needs people who feel deeply and know exactly what to do next. So now you've stopped apologizing for what you are. Good. But here's where it gets harder and more honest. Because there is a version of empathy that isn't a superpower. There is a version that quietly destroys you. And if we don't talk about it directly, everything else I'm going to say today will be built on sand. This is the version most empaths are actually living in right now. And it doesn't look like strength. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like resentment you can't explain. It looks like lying awake at 2 a.m. carrying someone else's pain as if it were your own unpaid debt. This is what unowned empathy does. And it is dangerous, but not in the good way. Here's what's actually happening psychologically when you move through the world as an unexamined empath. You enter a room and your nervous system immediately begins scanning, not consciously, but automatically, for emotional data. Who is tense? Who is hurting? Where is the conflict hiding beneath the surface? And because your attunement is so finely calibrated, you pick up everything. You feel the weight of your colleague's anxiety. You absorb your partner's unspoken grief. You sit across from someone in a difficult conversation, and somewhere in your body, you begin to carry what they are feeling. You think this is connection, and in part, it is. But when there is no boundary between their emotional world and yours, that isn't empathy anymore. That is enmeshment. And enmeshment, as any trauma-informed clinician will tell you, is not love. It is a loss of self. Mate writes about this with extraordinary precision. The way that people who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments learn to outsource their sense of safety to other people's moods. You became so skilled at reading the room because at some point, reading the room kept you safe. Your empathy didn't emerge in a vacuum. For many of you, it was forged in environments where emotional attunement wasn't a gift, it was a survival strategy. You learned to feel what others were feeling before they could express it, because anticipating someone's emotional state gave you a moment, just a moment, to prepare, to adapt, to protect yourself. That adaptation was brilliant. It kept you intact when your environment could not. But the problem with survival strategies is that they don't automatically retire when the threat is gone. You carry them forward into adulthood, into relationships, into workplaces, and you keep absorbing, keep scanning, keep taking on, long after the original danger has passed. What once protected you is now the very thing exhausting you. And this is the critical distinction that most conversations about empathy never make. There is a profound difference between feeling with someone and being consumed by them. One is an act of conscious presence. The other is an unconscious dissolution of self. One leaves you energized by connection. The other leaves you depleted, resentful, and quietly wondering why you always end up holding everyone else's weight while yours goes unwitnessed. Owning your empathy means doing the difficult, deeply human work of learning where you end and someone else begins. It means developing the capacity to witness pain without adopting it as your own. It means choosing to be present, fully, powerfully present, without disappearing into the experience of another person. Because here's the truth that most empaths need to hear. You cannot pour from a self that no longer exists. So we've established what empathy is not. It is not an apology, and it is not a sponge. But now I want to talk about what it actually is, in its fullest, most activated form. Because I think most people, even those who identify deeply as empaths, have been operating with a profoundly undersized understanding of what they are actually capable of. We have, as a culture, made the mistake of filing empathy under feelings. We put it in the same drawer as sensitivity, emotionality, tenderness, all valuable, all real, but all fundamentally passive in how we've framed them. And that framing has cost us enormously. Because empathy, true empathy at its most sophisticated, is not a feeling. It is a faculty. It is a form of intelligence, as structured, as trainable, and as strategically powerful as analytical reasoning or critical thinking. The difference is that it operates in a domain most institutions have never taught us to take seriously, the interior landscape of human experience. Think about what you are actually doing when your empathy is functioning at a high level. You are reading micro-expressions that most people miss entirely. You are tracking the gap between what someone says and what their body is communicating. You are sensing the shift in energy when someone walks into a room, the invisible tension, the unspoken need, the grief being held just below the surface of a composed face. You are processing layers of interpersonal data simultaneously, in real time, and drawing accurate conclusions about the emotional reality of the people around you. Now tell me, does that sound passive to you? Does that sound like something you should be apologizing for? Neuroscientist and researcher Dr. Daniel Siegel describes this capacity as mindsight, the ability to perceive the inner world of another person with clarity and depth. He argues it is one of the most essential human competencies we possess, foundational not just to healthy relationships, but to effective leadership, creative collaboration, conflict resolution, and cultural transformation. And here's what makes this particularly striking. Mindsight, like all forms of intelligence, can be refined. It can be directed. It can be applied with precision and intention rather than simply experienced as something that happens to you. This is the shift I'm asking you to make today. From empathy as experience to empathy as expertise. Because the most effective negotiators in the world don't just argue logically. They read the emotional undercurrent of a conversation and know exactly when to press and when to pause. The most transformative leaders don't just cast vision. They attune to the unspoken fears and unmet needs of their teams and meet people where they actually are, not where they're supposed to be. The therapists, the educators, the social architects who change lives, they are not simply kind. They are precise. Their empathy is a surgical instrument, not a wound. And you have that instrument. You have always had it. The question was never whether the capacity existed. The question was whether you would stop treating it like a burden and start treating it like the rare, refined, extraordinarily useful thing it actually is. Because here's what separates someone who feels deeply from someone who changes things. The person who changes things never forgot that feeling was just the beginning. It was the data. What you do with that data, that's where the power lives. Empathy without direction is just suffering. Empathy with intention is strategy. Now we need to talk about the word that makes most empaths instinctively uncomfortable. The word that, for many of you, carries a faint but persistent guilt, as though simply saying it out loud means you've chosen yourself over someone who needed you. The word is boundaries. And I want to dismantle, carefully and completely, the story you've been told about what that word means. Because somewhere along the way, boundaries got framed as walls, as rejection, as the emotional equivalent of slamming a door in someone's face and calling it self-care. And if you are a deeply feeling person, someone whose entire orientation toward the world is rooted in connection, in attunement, in being genuinely present for others, that framing makes boundaries feel like a betrayal of everything you are. So you don't set them, or you set them and immediately apologize for it, or you let them erode the moment someone pushes back, because the discomfort of disappointing someone feels, in your nervous system, almost indistinguishable from danger. But here is what boundaries actually are when we strip away the cultural noise. They are the structure that makes sustained empathy possible. They are not the opposite of connection. They are the condition for it. Think about it this way. A river without banks isn't more free. It's a flood. It loses direction, loses force, loses the very properties that made it powerful. The banks don't restrict the river. They are what give it momentum, focus, and the capacity to carve through landscape. Your boundaries are your banks. And without them, your empathy, no matter how profound, no matter how genuine, will spread thin, lose force, and eventually recede into resentment and depletion. Mate speaks extensively about the connection between the inability to set limits and the long-term physiological consequences. How people who chronically override their own needs in service of others don't just burn out emotionally. They get sick. The body, he argues, keeps score of every moment we betray ourselves in order to keep the peace. Every time you absorb what you should have deflected. Every time you say yes when every cell in your body is saying no. That is not empathy. That is self-abandonment wearing empathy's clothes. And this distinction matters enormously because people around you, the ones who have benefited from your boundaryless giving, have often, unconsciously, confused the two. They have come to expect your presence as an unlimited resource. They experience your limit setting not as healthy self-preservation, but as withdrawal, as abandonment, as a sudden and confusing change in the person they thought they knew. And that reaction, their discomfort with your boundary, becomes the very thing that convinces you the boundary was wrong. You read their disappointment with your finely tuned attunement. You feel it as if it were your own pain, and you fold. This is the cycle that keeps gifted, powerful, deeply intelligent empaths small. Not cruelty, not failure. Just a nervous system that was never taught the difference between someone else's discomfort and your own wrongdoing. So here is the reframe I want you to carry out of this room. Boundaries are not where your empathy ends. They are where your empathy becomes sustainable. They are the mechanism by which you transform a beautiful, exhausting gift into a durable, precise, life-changing practice. The moment you stop apologizing for your limits is the moment your empathy stops being a liability and starts being a force. A boundary isn't a wall between you and the world. It's the foundation you stand on to meet it. So you've reclaimed the label. You've done the work of understanding where your empathy ends and someone else's emotional world begins. You've accepted that boundaries are not betrayal, but architecture. And you've begun to see your capacity for attunement not as a sensitivity to manage, but as an intelligence to deploy. All of that is real progress. Profound progress, actually. But there is one more shift that separates the empath who has done the inner work from the one who has truly become dangerous, in the best possible sense of that word. And it is the shift from being reactive to being intentional. Here is what reactive empathy looks like in practice. You walk into a room and you feel everything. The tension in the air, the unspoken conflict between two colleagues, the anxiety someone is working very hard to conceal behind professionalism, the sadness sitting quietly at the edge of someone's smile. And because you feel it so immediately, so viscerally, you respond to it. You move toward the pain. You adjust your behavior. You reshape yourself around the emotional reality of the environment before you've even taken a breath and asked yourself a single conscious question. The room sets the terms. You follow. This is not mastery. This is gifted reactivity. And there is a ceiling to what reactivity can accomplish, no matter how sophisticated the underlying capacity. Intentional empathy operates from an entirely different orientation. It begins not with the room, but with you, with a conscious, grounded awareness of your own internal state before you engage with anyone else's. This is what the contemplative traditions have always understood, what modern neuroscience is now confirming with increasing clarity. The regulated nervous system is not a luxury. It is the prerequisite for everything else. You cannot read a room accurately when you are dysregulated. You cannot make clear, empathically intelligent decisions when your own unprocessed emotional material is flooding the channel. Self-awareness, in this context, is not navel-gazing. It is professional preparation. Mate and others working at the intersection of trauma and neuroscience consistently point to this truth, that our capacity to be present for others is in direct proportion to our willingness to be present with ourselves first. The empath who has done their own work, who knows their triggers, who has mapped the terrain of their own interior landscape, doesn't just feel more accurately, they act more effectively. They can choose, in real time, whether to lean in or step back. They can decide which emotional data is relevant to the moment and which belongs to an older story. They can be moved without being swept away. This is the art of what we might call deliberate attunement, the conscious, skilled deployment of emotional intelligence toward a specific, constructive outcome. It is the difference between a musician who feels the music deeply and one who feels it deeply and has trained their hands to express it with precision. Feeling alone is not enough. Technique transforms feeling into impact. And this matters because the world is full of genuinely sensitive people who spend their entire lives being tossed around by the emotional weather of their environments, responding, absorbing, recovering, repeating, never quite stepping into the authorship that their intelligence actually makes possible. The move from reactive to intentional is not a suppression of your empathic nature. It is the full maturation of it. You were never meant to simply survive the emotional weight of the world around you. You were built to navigate it. And that requires a hand on the wheel, not just an open heart. We have traveled a long road together in this conversation. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge what that journey has actually looked like, because it mirrors, almost exactly, the journey every empath must take to fully step into what they are capable of. We began with a word, just, and we dismantled it. We looked honestly at the wreckage that unowned empathy leaves behind. We reframed attunement as intelligence, established boundaries as architecture, and named intentionality as the mark of true mastery. And now we arrive at the final point, the one that all the others were quietly building toward. What do you actually do with all of this? What happens when the empath who has done the work walks into a room? I'll tell you what happens. The room changes. Not metaphorically, not as a pleasant idea. Literally, neurologically, interpersonally, the room changes. Because human beings are not isolated units processing their environments independently. We are profoundly, inescapably relational creatures, and our nervous systems are in constant, mostly unconscious conversation with the nervous systems around us. This is the science of co-regulation, the documented phenomenon by which one person's regulated, grounded, attuned presence has a measurable calming effect on the physiological states of people nearby. You have felt this. You've walked into a room where someone calm and genuinely present was standing, and something in you settled without knowing why. That wasn't coincidence. That was biology. And here is the staggering implication of that science for everyone in this room. You are capable of being that person. The empath who has done the inner work, who has claimed their intelligence, established their boundaries, and learned to move with intention rather than reaction. That person doesn't just participate in the emotional ecosystem of a room. They regulate it. They shift the culture of a conversation, a team, an organization, simply by virtue of how they show up. This is not soft power. This is perhaps the most direct, most immediate form of influence that exists between human beings. Think about the institutions that are failing right now. The workplace is fractured by disconnection, the communities paralyzed by distrust, the leadership structures that produce results but destroy the people inside them. What is missing in almost every one of those environments is not more strategy, not more productivity frameworks, not more data. What is missing is the capacity to see people, to genuinely, skillfully, and consistently attune to the human beings inside the system and respond to what they actually need. That capacity, that is yours. That is precisely what you have been carrying and minimizing your entire life. This is why the word dangerous is exactly right. Because a fully activated empath, one who has moved from apology to agency, from reactivity to intention, from self-abandonment to grounded presence, that person is genuinely threatening to every system, every dynamic, every relationship structure that depends on people staying small, staying numb, staying disconnected from one another. You cannot manipulate someone who reads the room better than you do. You cannot gaslight someone who has done the deep work of knowing their own interior landscape. You cannot maintain a culture of dysfunction when someone in the room keeps gently, persistently, skillfully naming what is actually happening. That is your gift. That is your responsibility. And it is long past time you stopped walking into rooms like a guest and started walking in like someone who knows they were built for exactly this. You were never just an empath. You were always the person the room was waiting for.